Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the biogeochemical cycles, more commonly called the nutrient cycles, and how they tie into the biomolecules, giving us the large macroscopic picture rather than just the tiny little molecular picture. Okay, so these are going to be called the biogeochemical cycles for two simple reasons. Bio for the living things that are part of them, and the geo for the non-living things such as the rocks and erosion and sedimentation and all of the plate tectonic stuff that goes into making those nutrients available. The key players for all of these processes are going to be our decomposers. And the decomposers are necessary because they are what take the dead tissues, break them back down into their individual nutrient components so that other living things can assimilate them and grow. So if you think about putting a plant in the ground, the plant isn't just existing off of photosynthesis, it also has to absorb nutrients from the soil. And those nutrients in the soil, if they all get absorbed into plants, then that soil becomes depleted. The natural way for those nutrients to be put back into the soil is for the plants to die, decompose, returning those nutrients. So what we see then is death is actually necessary for these cycles to continue because the nutrients that are locked up in living tissues have to be broken back down for new organisms to assimilate them and grow. The two basic types of geochemical cycles are going to be global cycles, things that move around the planet. So that's going to be the water cycle and the atmospheric cycles and anything that is in those. And then your regional stuff is going to be basically what's in the soil. Although through erosion, the soil can get into the water and then into the oceans. But typically soil, even if it does get into the water, is not going to travel that far because the soil particles will become sediment at the bottom of rivers, lakes, and oceans. So they still don't cycle that globally. Although you can have some global cycling with wind erosion, but that is not the common way. Our nutrient reservoirs, these are going to be where all of these nutrients are kept. So we have things that are going to be located in the atmosphere and the soil and the water. So these are going to be your basic abiotic sources where the nutrients are kept. These will then be moved by assimilation into living things. And then you get all of your food webs and your food chains and everything cycling that way. Living stuff will die, then it will decompose back into your reservoirs, or the dead stuff can fossilize and become things like coal and oil. Peat is just heavily compressed moss that is slightly decomposed. These things, when we burn them, go back to the atmospheric and back into that reservoir. And then when you have stuff here, it can form rock, rock can erode, and so you get all these different processes of the biogeochemical cycles. Water cycle, very quickly, water evaporates, water precipitates, and that's the water cycle. The water is mainly found in the ocean. 97% of the water on the planet is in the ocean. About 2% is found in the glaciers, 2 to 3%, depending on what numbers you're looking at. But only 1% of the water on the planet is in lakes, rivers, and the groundwater. That's where we get our water. So you think about the Great Lakes, you can see those from space. Think about the huge rivers like the Colorado, the Nile, the Amazon River. These are rivers that are big enough to be seen from space, and all of that stuff is just 1%. That just really tells you how huge and deep the oceans are and how much water is really in there. Very little is found in the atmosphere, so that is constantly changing based on the amount of precipitation. And then, of course, you've got your main processes: evapotranspiration, so that is evaporation directly from the ground, transpiration through plants, condensation, that'd be dew on the ground, precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, fog. And then you could add in here percolation. And percolation is when the water hits the ground and trickles down through the soil and becomes groundwater. So these are your major processes going through, which you see all the time. You can look at that as much as you need to. Next, we have the carbon cycle. And we already know that carbon is extremely important because it's the base of all of our biological molecules. Carbon is found everywhere. It's in living creatures, it's in the soil, it's in the air as carbon dioxide and methane. It's dissolved in the oceans and the waters as CO2. As stuff dies and becomes sediment, it's there, but it's everywhere. So our key processes are going to be photosynthesis, which is going to trap the CO2. Excuse me. We're going to trap the CO2 or fix it into sugars and then into complex polymers. And then cellular respiration is going to be the breakdown of those compounds, releasing the CO2 back into the atmosphere. Humans will add to that process by burning fossil fuels. And then volcanoes will be another way that extra CO2 is put into the environment that we have no control over. One thing to reiterate is that cell respiration is going to occur in producers. That means plants carry out cell respiration as well. And your decomposers, such as your fungi and your bacteria, can carry out that as well. Basic processes, you see the interaction of respiration, giving off CO2, photosynthesis, fixing it. That's your main cycle right there. And then what human activities do is we are adding extra CO2. This is a super neat, awesome arrow. To that, increasing the carbon dioxide percentages in the atmosphere. And we will talk about the implications of that in terms of climate change later. All right, so why is the nitrogen cycle so important? Well, nitrogen is part of amino acids. Amino acids make up proteins. Proteins make up the bulk of your body. They make up your cell organelles. They make up the enzymes that run everything. And they are also part of nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA, and those are kind of important. The biologically available forms, plants are able to use ammonium and nitrate. They prefer nitrate, and they will convert both of these into amino acids, which is the only way that we can actually use nitrogen. We have no capability of using either ammonia or nitrate. We can break nitrates down, possibly, unless you have an enzyme deficiency. And ammonia is actually the waste product of protein digestion, which is why we need something like the kidneys to remove that. Bacteria can use all different kinds of forms of nitrogen depending on the type of bacteria. So they can use the ammonia, the nitrate, or the nitrite. Please know those formulas. And animals can only use amino acids. So we have to get the amino acids either from plants or from other animals through our diet. Where is nitrogen found in the environment? The major place is going to be in the atmosphere as diatomic nitrogen, or N2. That is going to be biologically inert to us. We breathe that in all the time. It does nothing. We breathe it in, we breathe it out. It does dissolve slightly into our bloodstream, but when it's there, it doesn't do anything. Nitrogen is found wherever biological material is found, so dead stuff in the soil and the sediments. It's found in the biomass. It's dissolved in the water as nitrogen, diatomic nitrogen, also as the nitrates, and the ammonium. And of course, it's in you. So this is one of the reasons that compost is very good. As you take dead stuff and you let it break down, that is going to have lots of nitrogen in it, which then you can use to fertilize your garden if you so choose. Into us. All right, your main processes are going to be focused on what the bacteria do. The most critical thing is going to be nitrogen fixation. This is where bacteria take the atmospheric nitrogen and eventually convert it into nitrate, but they will go to ammonia first, then to nitrite, then to nitrate. Those all have charges on them. Lightning can combine nitrogen and oxygen into nitrate, and we can also take advantage of that basic process that is known as the Haber process, and that is the use of making industrial fertilizer, which can then be turned into bombs. So Haber got really rich trying to help the Nazi war effort. So there's a video that will be in the playlist that you can watch about that. Ammonification is when bacteria form ammonia. That is typically referring to when the decomposers break things down to form ammonia, not nitrogen fixation. Nitrification is when ammonia is converted to nitrite and then to nitrate, and then this is what plants really like, and they will take that in by assimilation, absorbing it through their roots. Denitrification is when you have some bacteria that are going to take the nitrate and reverse the process and turn it back into atmospheric oxygen and nitrogen. And all of this stuff is really important, and some organisms have decided to work together in an important mutualism. I think we're getting a guest lecturer in a moment. Well, hello, Pabu. How are you? Would you like to contribute to the nitrogen cycle and talk about how your pea smells so bad because of all the ammonia in it? Would you? No? No? Okay, then go away. All right, so legumes are plants that are things like peas and beans that have cooperated with nitrifying bacteria, and the bacteria live in these tiny little root nodules, and they absorb nitrogen and convert it to nitrate for the plants, and then the plants feed the bacteria sugar, so it's a nice little mutualism. This is your basic nitrogen cycle. This is a very nice, colorful picture. On the next slide, I'm going to draw it in a different way so you can kind of see it in a more simplified manner, and maybe that will help you remember it a little easier. Okay, so our key players for this will be bacteria. Bacteria will take atmospheric nitrogen, turn it into ammonia. If it's NH3, it's ammonia. If it's NH4 with a +1, that's ammonium. So once the ammonia reacts with water, it becomes ammonium. So make sure it's a slight difference. And this is what's known as nitrogen fixation, because the atmospheric nitrogen is fixed into a biologically available form. The NH4 is then going to be turned into nitrate after it is turned into nitrite. And then this process of going from ammonia to nitrate is called nitrification. And then denitrification is from NO3 back to N2. All of that, that's the bacteria cycle. Now, where does this come in? Plants will take the nitrate in the process of assimilation and they will turn that nitrate into amino acids. Proteins, nucleic acids, etc. And then here we go through the food chain, herbivores, carnivores, etc. Then everybody is going to die. Skull and crossbones, death. Now, as things die and decompose, they are going to return and become ammonia, and that is ammonification. And that's why dead stuff stinks. As the ammonia is being produced, as the sulfur compounds and the proteins are being broken down, dead stuff smells, and we're like, oh, that's nasty, and that's good because you shouldn't eat decomposing things because they're filled with bacteria, and that will make you very sick. All right, so this is I think, simpler, not as pretty, but it shows you the two different cycles. You've got your first cycle here, which is the bacterial cycle, and then you've got your plant animal cycle going there. And so they are complete. All right, phosphorus cycle is the same as the sulfur cycle. Both of these things are going to originate from rock. So you have sulfur and phosphorus in the rock, and the rocks will erode, the plants will assimilate them, and you have the whole cycle. Phosphorus is part of nucleic acids, sulfur is part of proteins, phosphorus is also part of phospholipids which are in our cell membrane, and then of course ATP, the P stands for phosphate, and that is what drives all of our energetics inside of our cells. Bones and teeth for phosphorus, sulfur is really just going to be found in proteins. Phosphate is the biological form that we are going to use. Sulfur is just in sulfur, and they are found in rocks. And then, of course, if it's in biological material, it's anywhere biological material is found, either living or dead. And your key processes is releasing that sulfur and the phosphorus from the rock through erosion, wind, rain, freeze, fracture, etc. And then the producers absorb it, decomposition, and then it can go back to being rock by sedimentation, and the cycle continues. So it's basically this. You have weathering, runoff, plants absorb it, and you get your basic biological life cycle. Now, decomposition, again, that being the key thing that makes all of this work, because it takes the dead stuff and makes it available again. If there were no decomposers, life would stop because eventually everything would die and everything would just be locked up and nothing could use it again. Now, the rate of decomposition depends on the climate. So where are things going to rot best or decompose best? Where it's warm and where it is humid. So decomposers like heat and wet. So tropical rainforest is going to be the best place for decomposition to occur. So if it is there, a few months to a few years for a tree to decompose, 4 to 6 years in a regular forest like where we live. So it is directly related to the rate of evapotranspiration. And that is simply, if it's warmer and more humid, plants are going to transpire more, which means that things will rot faster. All right, humans and why we are terrible for the environment. There are many, many, many reasons why we are terrible for the environment. One of those reasons is that we kind of mess up the nutrient cycles in lots of different ways. So one of the things that we do is we like to grow lots of food in one area where they naturally wouldn't grow. And then all of those plants, so think giant fields of corn, that corn is sucking all those nutrients out of the soil. In a natural system like a forest, the trees suck the nutrients out of the soil, but then the trees die. They decompose and those nutrients go back into the soil. Well, what we do, we grow all of this food, we harvest that food, and we send that food to other parts of the planet. And so those nutrients do not get returned to the soil, and therefore the soil begins to become depleted of those nutrients. So in order for the soil to continue to be productive, we have to put nutrients back in, and that has typically and traditionally been done using inorganic fertilizer rather than organic fertilizer or compost, and that has large effects on the ecosystem as well. In addition to removing nutrients from one area and moving them to another, we also tend to introduce excess nutrients through many different activities. One of the things that humans do is by burning fossil fuels, we introduce nitrates into the air. And once the nitrates are in the air, they begin to react with other things, forming what are known as secondary pollutants. As those secondary pollutants form, some of them will go up into the stratosphere, and once they are there, they will react with UV radiation and start destroying the ozone, that process we talked about in a bit. And they can also contribute to global warming and climate change. Nitrates and sulfur, when they get into the air, will react with water to form different types of acid, mainly nitric acid and sulfuric acid, and that forms things like acid rain, acid snow, and acid fog. All of those are known as acid deposition. Now, because we are taking nutrients from one area and moving them to another, so you harvest the corn and you sell it, that begins to deplete the soil from the nutrients for proper plant growth, so farmers have to put those nutrients back into the soil. That is traditionally done with inorganic fertilizers because they are concentrated, they are cheap, and they are easy to distribute. However, 50 to 80% of the fertilizer that is added to the soil actually is not absorbed by the plants. And it is going to move through the soil and enter the groundwater. It's going to enter into streams, to ponds, into rivers and lakes. As that happens, that begins the process of eutrophication. Excuse me, which is where that extra nutrient begins to cause algae to grow very rapidly. If you've ever seen a really green, scummy pond or lake, that's because it has had excess nutrients go into it. And you might think, oh, well, that's extra algae, so that's more photosynthesis, that's more food for the things living there, that's more oxygen. And that's initially true, but what begins to happen is as you get the nutrients come in, that's nutrients, then your algae growth goes up, and then the algae begins to die. And once the algae begins to die, that begins to be decomposed. And the decomposed algae is going to require oxygen by the decomposers. And once you have enough dead algae, that can actually create areas in the water that are either hypoxic or anoxic, which we'll talk about in the next slide as well. And this can essentially just create pockets of low oxygen water, which can kill fish. So the fish will actually drown because the oxygen levels are so low. Other things that can happen if you have tainted groundwater, the nitrates can get into the blood and they can cause a condition called methemoglobinemia. The nitrates normally are going to be broken down by enzymes in our bodies so that they don't harm us, but some people lack those enzymes, particularly babies. And what will happen is the nitrate binds to the hemoglobin and outcompetes the oxygen, and therefore less oxygen is being transported through the body, causing the people to become cyanotic or cyanosis. Basically, that means their fingertips, their lips, and their skin begins to get a little bit of a blue color because they don't have enough oxygen. So if you've ever, put a rubber band on your finger and your finger starts to get a blue tinge to it, that's a cyanotic finger. And with babies, this can be called blue baby syndrome because their body cannot properly process those nitrates. So here is another picture of the eutrophication process. So the nutrients are coming in and you get lots of algae growth. The algae dies, the bacteria and stuff go crazy, and then you get the decrease in the oxygen. So initially it is hypoxic, so hypo for below, oxic for oxygen, and then eventually it can become anoxic, which means no oxygen, and then you get lots of death. Other things that we do, we have excess consumers on the planet because we like to eat them. And so as we are growing livestock, we are going to have lots of waste from them. So manure is very gross and very plentiful from cows and pigs and chickens and turkeys. And you have to do something with that. And that can cause water contamination, soil contamination. And also we have to feed them. So the food that could go to humans goes to cows and pigs and chickens. So we have to grow lots of food to feed our food. And if we just decreased the amount of meat that we ate, we'd have a lot more food for the planet. And of course, as we are doing everything, we are using fossil fuels for our energy production. So we get lots of CO2 in the atmosphere, nitrates and sulfur output. These will contribute to acid rain, which can affect the soil and the water quality. And they can also contribute to global warming, which can lead to climate change. Okay, so one of the major things that can happen with the burning of fossil fuels is the production of acid precipitation. The main thing that causes acid precipitation is the sulfur that's in the coal that we burn, some of it from the nitrogen, but it's mainly from the sulfur. When the sulfur compounds and nitrogen compounds get into the atmosphere, they make sulfuric acid and nitric acid, which lowers the pH of the rain. And then, of course, pH is significant to everything because every biological system has a range of tolerance. And if you lower the pH of the soil or the water for those organisms, it can affect their ability to grow and thrive. Normal rain has a pH of about 5.6. which is already acidic, but acid precipitation is anything that's below that due to the compounds that we pump into the atmosphere. Acid precipitation tends to be a regional problem because the compounds that are put into the air tend to precipitate out before they travel very far. The majority of the acid rain that we experience in Chattanooga is actually from the power production in Alabama. So as the wind currents take the pollution from Alabama, it's going to chemically change and then precipitate onto us. So that is an issue. And that's why you need national laws for things like air quality, because air travels, and you could have one state like Alabama being a super polluter, and they're like, we don't care because it's going to go somewhere else, but then we have the problem from it. All right, so as the pH of the soil and the water change, then this is going to affect the soil, because the pH of the soil affects how positive ions like calcium, iron, magnesium are going to be moved out of the soil. Normally, the plants have to pull those ions out through a process called cation exchange. And when you add a bunch of hydrogen ions from the acid, that causes these ions to leach out much faster out of the soil, which then lowers the nutrient content for the plants, which can affect their health. Plus, if the pH of the soil lowers too much, then the plant roots themselves can be damaged, which will then affect the plant health. Same thing for water. If the pH of the rain coming into the water system, the stream, the pond, or the lake, if it's too low, it can cause the pH of the water to change. And then some organisms are very sensitive to those changes. So scientists look for those really sensitive species in an aquatic system. So if an ecologist goes to a pond and they see something like salamander larvae, they'll be like, oh, this is a healthy pond because these are really sensitive to pH. Things that are very sensitive are called indicator species. If indicator species are absent, that is an indicator that there's something wrong with that system. Maybe it's some type of sewage, maybe it's the pH or temperature or something like that. Here is a map of your general pHs of rain around the country. And you can see green is pretty close to normal. And then when you get into the yellows and the reds and the oranges, then that's where it is very low. And what you see up here in the Northeast, you have a much larger problem with acid rain because of the amount of industrialization that is up there. So you can also see here, like down here in West Virginia, there is a very low pH, lots of coal mining, coal production, and so the regional problem due to the activities that are carried on there. Moving on, we have climate change or enhanced global warming. Global warming is not necessarily bad. That is because we need to keep our planet warm. So since the Industrial Revolution, CO2 levels have gone up greatly because of the amount of fossil fuels that we have burned. These are just some general measurements. You don't need to know those. But what happens is the sunlight comes in, it is absorbed by the planet. Some of it is reflected. The higher the reflective surface, the more of the light that is not absorbed as heat. That's known as the albedo effect. So something with a high albedo is going to reflect a lot of light. So stuff like ice reflects a lot of sunlight. Therefore, that sunlight is not converted to heat. So this is why you'll see that modern day school buses, UPS vans, they have a white roof on them to help reflect the sunlight so that it does not warm up as much. This is why a light colored car is not going to heat up as much as a dark colored car. However, cars will heat up very quickly because it's the same basic idea as a greenhouse and what the atmosphere does. The light comes in through the glass, it hits the seats in the interior of the car, and they are typically dark in color, so they absorb that solar energy, that solar light, and it converts it to heat, and then the glass in the car traps that heat and it gets super, super warm inside the car. This is why you'll see some people put those kind of reflector things in the windshield that are a mirrored surface that bounce the light out. That's increasing the albedo effect of the interior of the car. And another way to keep your car cooler is to open the windows a little bit so that the heat can escape. This is why you should never leave a pet or a child in the car when it's even moderately warm outside, because it can get extremely hot in that car very, very quickly, and they can die of overexposure. So all this is known as the greenhouse effect. So on the planet, the light comes through and the heat is trapped by the atmospheric gases. If we did not have that, the average air temperature on the Earth would be negative 18 degrees Celsius. That's the average. That is cold. That is really cold. So the greenhouse effect is critical for life to happen on the planet. On Venus, the atmosphere is much denser than it is on the Earth. So the atmosphere, or the planet temperature, is much higher. It's also closer to the sun. So basically what happens, think of our atmospheric gases as blankets, and then the more CO2 and greenhouse gases like methane and nitrogen oxides that we put into the atmosphere, the more blankets we have, so that causes the Earth to lose its heat at a lower pace, and therefore the overall temperature of the planet is going to increase. Now the thing is, the oceans are a massive, massive regulatory mechanism for our planet. Thinking back to the specific heat of water, 4.185, the amount of energy that the oceans can absorb is incredible. So that helps keep our planet fairly maintained. That's why scientists are always talking about that 2-degree difference in the ocean temperature. If the ocean goes up 2 degrees Celsius, the amount of heat that thing has absorbed is vastly, huge amount of energy, and that is eventually going to impact the climate as hurricanes, as changing weather patterns. So that is why we really need to try to keep the Earth from getting too hot. All right, other things we do, we have other chemicals that go into the air and they go up into the stratosphere where the ozone layer is. Ozone is important because it blocks the highest energy forms of UV light. UV light is going to come through and damage DNA in tissues. The ozone has been thinning, although it is recovering. It is getting better. And the main destructive element are going to be chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. And these have been used for a long time as propellants in aerosol cans until the 1970s, when they figured this out. And they're like, we need to ban the use of CFCs in aerosol cans, so now they just put in CO2. But chlorofluorocarbons are still used. One common one is Freon, which is used in refrigerators and air conditioners, because they are excellent, excellent heat sinks. They are able to absorb a lot of energy and remove it, And that's how air conditioners and refrigerators work. The warm air passes over the tubes on the back of your refrigerator. If you can get to the back of your refrigerator to look at it, there is this whole system of tubes. And as the air from the refrigerator passes over those tubes, the Freon, or the CFCs, absorb that heat very effectively, making the inside of the refrigerator much cooler. And another great thing about CFCs is they are biologically inert, which means that if you got sprayed in the face with CFCs, it's not going to do anything to you. The biggest problem, though, is when they get to the stratosphere, the UV light hits them and it breaks them apart into very, very reactive chemicals called free radicals. And the free radicals then go on to break apart the ozone in a very cataclysmic way, and a very catalytic way as well. So here's what we see. We see a CFC molecule here. The CFC molecule is getting broken apart by the UV light. And so then you have a free radical chlorine and a free radical CFC. The little dot represents a free electron. That's what makes it a free radical. That makes it very reactive because it's not in a complete orbital. It wants to react. It wants to be stable. So our free radical chlorine binds to our ozone and it splits it apart into free oxygen. Yay, nice and stable. But this over here, this chlorine monoxide, is still a free radical. And that binds with another free oxygen like this, and that produces another molecular oxygen. But that free radical is back. And so it just keeps doing this process over and over and over until this free chlorine finds a more stable molecule than ozone. And that's called a sequestering molecule, and binds it up so it's no longer reactive. And so this process, so one CFC can destroy thousands and thousands and thousands of ozone molecules, and they can last in the atmosphere for years and years and years. And then, of course, as the ozone thins, more UV light comes through, does more skin damage to plants, damage to materials like plastics and paint and all kinds of things like that, causing lots of damage. The main thing being the damage to our DNA. The way that this works, the way that it causes skin cancer, is in our DNA. If you've got cytosine, adenine, guanine, thymine, blah, blah, blah that way, blah, blah, blah that way, and you've got your complementary sides over here, what the UV light will do is it will hit these thymines right here, that in a different color, and it will bond them together. It's called a thymine dimer. And that disrupts the way that the DNA is read. The cell can fix that. There's a mechanism to do that. But if it doesn't, then the body's like, damage DNA, destroy this cell. And that cell dies. And as you are exposed to UV, and if you're exposed to a lot of it very quickly, then a lot of those cells start to die, and that causes inflammation. And that's what the sunburn is. It's all of those damaged cells dying, being destroyed by your body because they can't be fixed. And it hurts, and it swells, and it's painful. And then eventually it peels off because the body starts producing new skin cells to replace them, and then the old layer comes off. So that's good, get rid of those damaged cells, but sometimes the damaged cells don't get destroyed, and that can potentially lead to abnormal growth of the skin cells, and that's what skin cancer is. So UV light, I would say avoid it altogether, but that's not good either because we need some UV to make vitamin D. We need the vitamin D to build our bones and to make our immune system healthy. As we produce lots of chemicals and through industry and whatever, we produce lots of toxicants. Toxicants are man-made poisons. Toxins are naturally made poisons. And the problem with these is they can kill stuff. But as they are introduced into the environment, they can start to become absorbed by plants and animals and then move up through the food chain. And as they move up through the food chain, they can accumulate and magnify. So basically what will happen is, say, some plankton or some algae absorb some of these toxic compounds in very, very low concentrations, and they store them in their tissues. That is biological accumulation or bioaccumulation. And then when a bunch of stuff eats that algae, it takes in all of that bioaccumulated toxin. And since the upper trophic level has to eat more of the lower trophic level, it gets more of that toxin in it, so it becomes more concentrated in the next trophic level, and that's what's known as biomagnification. So as you move up through the food chain, the larger the animal is, the more it has to eat the stuff below it, which has to eat more of the stuff below it and below it. So you get this triangle of toxicity. So your lowest concentration is down here, and then as you move up, you get more and more concentrated. And so at the very, very top, it's a super concentrated amount of toxin, and that's where you begin to see the negative effects of that toxin on the organism. So the top level carnivores tend to have the worst response to these toxicants in the environment. The classic example of this is going to be mercury. Mercury is released in very, very small amounts from the burning of coal. And that mercury in that form is actually not too bad. It's an insoluble form of mercury, and it gets into the water through the rain and the precipitation, and it just kind of sinks down to the sediment of the lakes and the oceans. The problem is bacteria convert that mercury into methylmercury, which makes it soluble. Now that it's soluble, it can be absorbed by plankton and algae, and then it starts to move up through from the phytoplankton to your primary consumer, being maybe some shrimp. So the shrimp have to eat a whole bunch of this to survive. These fish have to eat a whole bunch of shrimp, and so the shrimp have absorbed all of the mercury in the phytoplankton. The fish absorb all of the mercury in the shrimp, and then the bird, which eats the fish, and it's going to eat multiple of those fish, and you begin to see the highest concentrations in those birds. And the big thing about birds is a lot of this has an impact on their babies growing in the eggs, or in the case of DDT, it can actually make the eggshells very thin, so then when the birds go to incubate their eggs, the eggs actually just break. Interesting study here. What this is showing is that in the polar latitudes, so the more north or south you go from the equator, the higher the upper trophic levels have accumulated those toxins. And some of that is due to the fact that as you go farther from the equator, the animals tend to be bigger, which means they need to eat more. So they're going to have a higher biomagnification of those toxins. All right, other things that are biomagnified. DDT is an insecticide that has been outlawed in a lot of countries like the United States, but it's still used regularly in places like Africa. It's great for killing mosquitoes, and so it's used to help prevent malaria. We used to use DDT in the United States for lots of different insects, but it was mainly for mosquitoes. We used to have malaria in the United States, but we don't anymore because we wiped out those mosquitoes that carry the malaria. But what they started to notice in the United States is you had these birds just falling over dead. And they're like, why are these birds dying? and they did a toxicology study, and they had a high amount of DDE in them. DDE is the metabolite of DDT. So when the body absorbs DDT, it's fat soluble. So it gets stored in the fat, and then the body metabolizes from DDT to DDE, and they stand for di something blah 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 trichlorine. You don't have to know that. So they're insecticides. And then this was a big issue because the DDE in bald eagles caused their egg shells to become very thin, and then as the bald eagles incubated their eggs, they cracked, and that's why bald eagles became endangered. And then there were laws passed to prevent the DDT from being used, and now the bald eagle population has recovered so that they're no longer an endangered species. They're just protected because they're the national bird. Other types of things, you've got PCBs, which are polychlorinated bisphenols. Those are mainly from plastic manufacturing, so those accumulate in fatty tissue as well. Lead and cadmium. Lead is from paint and different manufacturing processes. Cadmium is mainly from batteries and some metal processes like chrome and alloys. Both of those can accumulate in the bone. Lead can affect nervous tissue and cause some mental functioning problems. And then cadmium's main thing is that it causes bones to kind of become weak and rubbery if you get enough of it in you. So this picture we see biomagnification again. So we're looking at the amount of toxin. These are PCBs, the polychlorinated bisphenols in the plankton. So then we see in the zooplankton it is higher because they ate a bunch of those. The tiny fish called smelt, even higher because they ate a bunch of zooplankton. Bigger fish, and then you see in the herring eggs it's very high, so that could affect the development of those chicks, causing that population to crash.